Thank you, everyone. I can see we're still ticking up slightly, but thank you if you're joining us just now. We'll get started straight away. We've got a couple of housekeeping things, sorry, to start with. Just to let you know, this session is going to be recorded. We will share that back at the end of the conference along with the materials. Comments and questions welcome in the chat as we go. Feel free to kind of add your comments and thoughts along the way. If we get time at the end, we'll try and pick up a couple of these, but also happy to kind of follow up after today if anyone does want to get in touch. And we'd also love it if you could take our very quick Data Talks feedback survey at the end. We'll put that link again at the end, just to let us know how we've done in the conference. And we'll come back to it at the end of the session. So first things first, just to introduce ourselves, my name is Rachel Newby. I'm Senior Analytics Designer at Essex County Council, and I've been working in various incarnations of performance and analytics teams at Essex for about 10 years now. Earlier this year, I qualified with the Open Data Institute as a data ethics professional, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. So also, Emily is here. I'll let you introduce yourself.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Emily Moss. I am an intelligence manager in the data and analytics team at Essex County Council. Similar to Rachel, have recently just completed the ODI's data ethics professional certification. And again, along with Rachel, I've been leading the work that we've been doing around data ethics at Essex County Council.
Lovely. So we're going to talk today a bit of an introduction about data ethics, a little bit about defining good data ethics and what that means as becoming a data ethics-led organisation. So if we jump straight in, I guess the natural place to start, what actually is data ethics? There's a few different definitions floating around, but this one comes from the Open Data Institute that we've already mentioned, and simply a branch of ethics that considers the impact of data practices on people, society, and the environment. First up, just to note that data practices is quite a broad term. So we're thinking about the whole range of impacts that data might have, thinking about what we collect, what we do collect, what we don't collect, how we use the data, when we use data, who we share it with, who we don't share it with, all of those different things across the data life cycle. The other thing that I like about this definition is that it doesn't only consider negative impacts and effects. So some definitions include the word adversely, so the adverse impact of data practices on people, society, and the environment. But in this case, we're not just thinking about those adverse effects. And obviously, while there are risks, it's really important to identify these and mitigate these. I hope, being data people, that you all will agree with me and see that it comes with a lot of positive impacts and opportunities as well. And we want to capture these and think about these when we're talking about the impact of our data practices, and to be able to identify and articulate where we're positively impacting people and society with our work. So on to the next slide. When we think about data ethics, some of the first examples we might think about are kind of uses of personal data. We might have heard kind of news stories about questionable uses of data around facial recognition software, or data that kind of uses protected characteristics in a way that we're not happy with. But data ethics is not only concerned with personal data. There can still be impacts for people and society or larger when even when personal data isn't being collected or used. So one example could be something like using place data. We've got the example of the game Pokemon Go, where we've got impacts around safety and privacy as a consequence of lots of people congregating in certain areas. And even though that data isn't personal data, it's place data, there can still be wider impacts for people. And the same with kind of lawful use of data. Data ethics isn't just about kind of what's legal, what we're allowed to do. It doesn't mean as long as we don't breach GDPR, we're fine. It doesn't mean we're necessarily being ethical, even if we are following all of those rules. And this is particularly the case around kind of new data techniques, new technologies. It's an area that's advancing really, really quickly, and that means that some of the legislation possibly hasn't kept pace. or might stop short of what we think is a kind of high ethical standard. So when we're talking about data ethics, we need to think about kind of whether we should do something rather than just whether we are allowed to do something. And lastly, around AI, a kind of similar vein, there is a lot of overlap between ethical AI and data ethics, but data ethics isn't only about AI. It's kind of ethical AI is a subset of the broader field of data ethics. And actually, ethics should be embedded into all our projects that use data and not just the kind of shiny new ones using AI, but actually we need to have that groundwork across everything that we do with data. Okay, so having sort of talked about the definition of data ethics a little bit, we also want to give a bit of an honourable mention to a related field, and that's research governance. So research governance and data ethics aren't the same thing, but they do have lots of similarities and again, lots of intersections. They both emphasise kind of ethical considerations around handling information. There's similar principles that they're grounded in, talking about transparency, fairness, accountability, but research governance specifically is focused on those ethical practices as part of that research process, conducting, analysing and communicating research. So it's not our main focus today, but we have included some links to resources around research governance as well when we get to the resources section at the end of the presentation. So we've talked a bit about what's ethical in terms of how important it is to act ethically and to consider ethics in our work, but we come to a bit of a philosophical question. How do we decide what is ethical and what do we mean when we say we want to act ethically? And actually, this is a really difficult question, and there's no definitive answer. I won't end the presentation there, but it would be a bit of a cliffhanger. But hopefully you can see in that cartoon, there's a little bit of a take on some of the views of different philosophers over the years, arguing around what is good. And to some extent, we have a similar kind of conundrum around what do we mean with ethical. It's going to depend on who you talk to and what their core beliefs and values are. It isn't a get out clause. It doesn't mean that just because we've got different views that we can give up and not bother thinking about ethics at all. There's still areas of consensus and kind of things that we can converge around. And the fact that we have these different viewpoints highlights how vital it is to include different voices and consider diverse perspectives in any project that we have and have that collaborative approach. The more that we're able to draw on these kind of diverse views and perspectives, the more we're able to identify and mitigate against potential bias and understand unintended or harmful consequences that might crop up. So we probably can all think of examples where we or a group that we know of has missed something really obvious because everyone has just been outside of that mindset or all come from the same group and it just hasn't occurred to them. The one that jumps to mind for me is the really famous example around NASA asking their female astronaut Sally Ride whether 100 tampons would be enough for a week-long space trip. And obviously that seems like a really silly, obvious question now, but as a group of men working at NASA in the 1980s, that was their collective blind spot, and they just didn't know because it wasn't part of their collective knowledge. And the kind of benefit of this collaborative approach is that by drawing as many different people in as we can, we kind of limit these blind spots, so we limit these areas that we don't have any background in. And what this collaborative approach looks like is going to be in practice really different from project to project. So we'll talk a little bit more later about approaches, different tools you can use, different frameworks that are available. But it could include something like review by an independent panel, engagement with different stakeholders, seeking input and free feedback on your kind of project design from a range of different perspectives, different people, working with those people who are likely to be on the impact end of your work. But ultimately, it's up to all of us to kind of start that conversation around ethics, to think about what we think is ethical, and to take those steps to kind of review our work and include those diverse impacts so that we can speak up if we have concerns and decide that ethical approach together. So we're gonna start a little bit of interaction. Now we've got some very quick fire examples. So you can either write in the chat or hopefully you can use the react buttons to kind of give a quick response, whether you think each of the examples, if you think it seems fine to you, seems like an ethical, good use of data, click the love button. If you're not sure, maybe that's not ethical and you're kind of going the other way, you can click the surprised face. And I mean, you can use any of the other reactions if you want to have a bit of a wild card, but you might be somewhere in the middle. So quick examples. First of all, employee monitoring software. Let us know what you think. An employer requires remote workers to install this software and it monitors their computer activity. They're monitoring their keystrokes. I'm seeing quite a lot of surprised faces. I think maybe people aren't keen on that one, but perhaps monitors the websites they visit, captures screenshots periodically, or a few people love that, a few people not so keen. Next one, social media data harvesting. A social media platform collects and sells user data to advertisers without their clear and explicit consent. Oh, lots of surprise faces there very quickly. So I think that doesn't seem very popular. I haven't seen any hearts yet, but someone might be keen. A few questions. Is the platform free? That's a very good question. It might be the price that you feel is worth paying for that service. Biometric data for public safety. So if a city uses facial recognition technology to identify and track individuals in public spaces and enhance public safety. A little bit of a mixed response here. So lots of people think, well, maybe public safety is a price worth paying. We might want to include that technology in order to have a safer society. It might be worth it. Trade-off. Number 4, algorithmic policing. So law enforcement uses predictive algorithms to allocate resources and identify potential crime hotspots. Lots of love for that one. That seems a popular one. Good idea. Cutting down on areas where there's lots of crime, focusing our resources, lots of kind of good impacts as well as some possibly negative ones. Deep fake technology in entertainment. So a film studio uses deep fake technology to create realistic scenes with deceased actors. Not much love for that one. We're not happy. A few laughing faces as well. Number 7, so student surveillance in schools. So what do we think about that? Schools using surveillance cameras and monitoring software to track student behaviour and performance. Might depend on what kind of student you were or what your children are like at school. But we've got kind of a mixed response there. Some people are happy, some maybe not. And one more last one. Political micro-targeting. So political campaigns using highly targeted ads based on their user profiles. So, you know, this obviously has been done, but we've got lots of surprise faces there. A few love reactions as well. So I think most of them, with exception of maybe 1 or 2, were very mixed responses. We had lots of maybe a little bit of consensus, but lots of kind of deliberation between the two, a few kind of outliers. And I think if we go, back to the next slide, that kind of illustrates that we don't often have a very simple yes or no answer between when we come to kind of deliberating these questions and these kind of data questions around what is worth using for and what isn't. Is not normally a quick and simple answer. It is kind of a process, and actually we want to decide whether or not it's ethical. We're probably not going to be able to give you a tool that you plug in all your project and it spits out a yes or no like an 8-ball. You probably need to kind of do a little bit more work than that, and actually it's going to be somewhere in the middle. So it might be that we do all of the kind of assessment around ethics and we decide that yes, this is worth the risk, we want to continue the project. There might be some kind of mitigations that we want to put in place, but actually broadly we're happy with it and it can go ahead. Or it might be that we need some really significant changes, but we still have positive impacts that we want to follow up on. So we then continue, but we make some changes around that we found out through this kind of process of assessing the ethical concerns. We can then start to make changes to our project design to make sure that we are in line with what we kind of minimize any negative effects. Or it might be that we kind of decide this isn't worth the risk. It might have some good impacts, but on balance, maybe the risks, the kind of fears might outweigh the positives, and we decide that it's not worth continuing. And our ethics assessment is our kind of reasoning to say this is why we're not going to continue with this project. And again, it's really important to consider all of these diverse viewpoints and different kind of perspectives as part of the project, because different people are going to have different kind of tolerances for risk and different sort of ideas of what they think is worth that risk. So why does ethics matter so much to us in the public sector, to us at Essex specifically, and kind of why are we now starting to talk more about ethics? Well, part of that reason is there's so much data, so much more data is available to us now, and we've got increasingly kind of powerful tools to process it. We can do much more. We've got lots of exciting opportunities, but that obviously opens up lots of kind of new areas of debate, new kind of questions around ethics as well. So we're using more data, we've got more data sources, our capabilities are kind of expanding quicker than ever. We're enabling us to create insight and can build that evidence for policy making, and hopefully improve our public services. But we also have that kind of duty of care around how all of that impacts our residents. And we have a responsibility to make sure that we are building that trust with the people whose data that we're holding. We've got to kind of protect their rights, protect against any negative impacts of our data use that they might kind of find. And we don't know whether at some point we might have kind of increased responsibilities to be transparent around our data. It seems likely that we're going in that direction with things like the algorithms, the models that we're using. We are likely going to need to be much more transparent, much more kind of open about the process of that, to give people that kind of reassurance that we are considering the ethics in everything that we do. So we don't want to be a closed box where people don't know what we're doing. And I think that kind of unknown generates a lot of fear. So we want to reassure people around that kind of that we are doing everything we do is coming with an ethical assessment. And our kind of research backs that up. So our recent ECTA research shows that our residents care about data ethics. They are interested in data and they want to make sure that we're using it responsibly. So ECTA launched a programme of citizen research and engagement. That was in 2020, and Essex residents were invited to share their views on data. So in general, you can view the full findings. We'll share the link to that. But in general, we found that people are relatively open to data sharing when it is explained to them, and they do have some concerns that need addressing. So this kind of ethical approach is how we kind of respond to that, and how we kind of take people with us on that journey and make sure they understand that we're taking that responsibility seriously. There's quite a few practical recommendations released in that report, shaping around collaboration, and part of that includes creating roles for the residents to be part of our work. So something we'll talk about again later is the data ethics panel, and that's again something that we can bring our residents into. It also kind of puts recommendations around our kind of communication of what we're doing, and talking to people about how we're protecting their rights, how we're handling their data, how we're making sure we behave ethically. And kind of 7 in 10 residents at the moment told us that they were comfortable sharing their data in order to generate insight that supports people, places and public services in ethics. So broadly there is support, but we want to take more people with us. We want to kind of reassure that we're going in the right direction.
Thanks, Rachel. So where do we start with this? So we all know now what we mean by data ethics, but we also understand some of the complexities around figuring out what exactly is ethical. And we understand the importance of data ethics broadly, but also specifically for public sector officers. So where do we start? There are lots of frameworks that can support you to think through and evaluate your own data practices, many of which share similar principles around transparency, fairness, and accountability. Within ECC, as Rachel and I said to start with, we have recently completed the Open Data Institute's Data Ethics Professional Certification. So over the next few slides, we're going to go through in a bit more detail what is within their data ethics framework, which they call the Data Ethics Canvas. So this is what the canvas looks like. It's a tool designed to help organisations navigate ethical considerations when working with data. It is a visual framework that you can see on the screen, and it intends to prompt discussions and decision making around various aspects of data use. The ODI iterate that this isn't intended to be a step-by-step process. It doesn't really matter where you start on the canvas, but it is really important that when you are working through this, it's done collaboratively with a diverse group of people. It's also not intended to be a kind of one and done document. It is intended to be a living document that we can kind of revisit as projects that we're undertaking progress. So that's a little bit difficult to see what's on there. So helpfully break the canvas down into 4 different sections. So data, impact, engagement, and process. So all the sections in pink are around data. So those sections ask you to consider data sources, limitations within the data, so biases that might exist, data that is being collected, but also data that we maybe have a gap around, the rights and legislative context of data collection. It's particularly important when we're working in the public sector because we will have different legislative context and when we can use data. The sections in yellow are all around impact. So those sections are asking you to really think about your reasons for using data in that project, consider the potential positive and also negative impacts that this project and your use of data might have on people and society. And then following on from that, the potential approaches that you might take to minimise any negative impacts that you may have identified. The green sections are all around engagement. So this is about communication and transparency. How do you want to communicate how you're using data? How are you being transparent with residents about how you're using data? Who do you want to involve in that engagement process? So we're building a product or using service user data. Have we considered involving service users in the engagement part of that project? And then finally, the blue sections are all around process. So this section is intended to help you think about what your next steps in the project are. So what should you prioritize? If you're building some kind of algorithmic model, when does that model need to be iterated or refreshed? If you're building a tool, do end users of that tool need training, for example? As we said at the start of the session, good data ethics processes should evaluate our data practice across the entirety of the data lifecycle. So that's all the way through from data collection through to how we share data and ultimately how and what we are using data for. So this isn't just about how we use data. This isn't just about building the next game-changing AI tool or large language models. The entirety of the data lifecycle, it's important that we think about ethical practices, including how we collect and share data, which brings us onto this idea of responsible data stewardship. So when we're talking about data ethics, it can be quite tempting towards overcaution, so thinking there could be ethical challenges, so maybe it's easier to just not do anything and not use the data, not share the data, and not do anything with it. But actually, hoarding data without using it isn't ethical either. So data stewardship is a foundational activity within any data lifecycle and is primarily concerned with how we collect, store, and share data. So organizations that steward data make important decisions about who has access to that data, for what purposes, and to whose benefit. And how that data is stewarded ultimately affects what type of products, services, and insights it can be used to create, and also what decisions it can inform and which activities it can support. So again, the ODI have developed the illustration that you can see on screen to explain how different approaches to data stewardship could impact our society, our environment, and I guess in some sectors, our economy. So in one future, data would not be accessible to those who need it due to organisations hoarding it. So a little bit about what we spoke about earlier. And in this scenario, the benefits of data would really only be seen by a few organisations. In another future where data might not be collected or used to the extent that it could due to some of those concerns about the harm it can cause people, that they call that scenario data fearing. So there's a lack of consideration of ethics and a lack of engagement with those affected by data's use. And this all really undermines trust, which may lead to people avoiding using services or withdrawing consent for data to be collected. And this really just means that we end up missing out on really crucial data and the use of it that could really support some of the work that we're doing. So innovation and creative use of data can have really positive impacts for the people of Essex. And if the use of personal data could prevent a crime or protect vulnerable individuals, we should probably take action. And the answer of whether that is ethical is likely on a spectrum, as we've sort of spoken about. But avoiding using data is not really an option, and it can be more ethical to act. So what does an ethical organisation look like to you? We're going to put a poll up, and this might take a little while to load. So you can join by scanning the QR code. And what we're asking you to do is vote on the top 3 characteristics that you think an ethical, responsible, or trustworthy organisation would have. We've got some responses coming in, so that's good. Transparency is a really big one. Transparency and privacy. Security. Just give it another minute or so for people to get their responses in. Hey, that's great. Thank you. We will leave the poll open because we're really interested to hear everyone's thoughts on this one. But I mean, we can see transparency is a really big one. And I think that it's clear that we have some shared values that we need to work on as organisations. And embedding these values really requires us to think about how we are providing kind of open communication with some of our residents and service users. So really encouraging open dialogue about how we're using data. Okay, so building an ethics-led culture. So becoming an ethics-led organisation is definitely a journey more than a destination. It's very much a continual process that involves building a culture where every decision considers the ethical implications. And we have responsibilities as both individuals and as a collective organisation to ensure the right tools and structures are in place and regularly used. So with all of that in mind, what are we doing at Essex County Council to ensure we build these values into our day-to-day work? So as we've spoken about already, we are using the data ethics canvas and also the ODI's consequence scanning toolkit when we are starting projects within the data analytics team at Essex. And we also have a data and research section on our internal insight portal. So this means that anyone in the council is able to have access to the projects that we have been undertaking within our data and research teams. We're also integrating ethics into our processes, so embedding ethical questions across our project lifecycle. We have a data ethics committee, which I will go into a little bit more detail about after this slide. And we have research governance and a research ethics process, which is managed by our research and citizen insight team. In terms of training and support, we have been offering both internal and external data ethics training through the Open Data Institute. We have our communities of practice, which I'm sure you've heard about if you've been to any of the other data talk sessions over the last couple of days. So that is where we can share best practice across a big community of data professionals across Essex. We are in the process of getting a data ethics My Learning module onto the My Learning platform, which for anyone internal to ECC is essentially the platform where we do kind of our organisation learning. And I think one of the kind of most important things that we are doing is starting the discussion about ethics. Ethics is really relevant to all of our roles, and kind of the broader the discussion, the better. So as I said, talk a bit more about the Essex Data Ethics Committee. So ECDA have been one of the first ODAs that have an independent data ethics committee. And this is to ensure we achieve a critical balance of the legal and ethical considerations of data use, maintain ethical accountability, and also public trust. So our ethics committee is made up of volunteer members, including data science specialists, experienced human rights experts, senior policy representatives, information governance specialists, and really importantly, residents of Essex. All of the volunteer members have been selected because of their personal and professional experience, and each members of that committee bring their individual perspective to all issues. And what they do is help us assess considerations and implications of our work, ensuring that the benefit is clear and that it's transparent. They provide meaningful, pragmatic advice that is in the public interest, translating key public law and human rights principles into practical considerations and guidance that can be addressed by data partners. But we also wanted to share a second example of good practice that can be found in the Lottie Data Ethics Case Study Library. And this example comes from Transport for London. So when TfL start a new initiative or make significant change to an existing process involving personal data, they will always carry out what is called a data privacy impact assessment, or a DPIA. And some examples of this include the data from customer journeys and tapping in and out of the network with an Oyster card, or how TfL kept people safe from COVID during the pandemic. And as part of TfL's efforts to ensure data ethics is a central part of their thinking, TfL have mirrored the Open Data Institute's data ethics canvas within its DPIA process. So each of those 15 elements of the canvas are reflected in their DPIA, so that privacy and ethics are as one, from identifying the need for data, how it will be found and accessed, through to engagement and consideration of impact and the risk. So it's just I think it's a really good example of a really practical way in which another authority is incorporating ethics into their culture. Rachel, I think I'm passing back to you.
Yes, so hopefully you're all feeling very convinced that data ethics is very important to you and something you should be considering in all of your work. So we wanted to kind of finish up today really by leaving you with some resources and tools that you can start building these into your ethics conversations in your day-to-day. And we will share these links around afterwards for reference. But I'll just give a quick background to a few of these. This is definitely not an exhaustive list, so there's plenty more things out there, but hopefully some of these different things might suit different projects, different teams. These are just some that we've found really helpful in our journey so far at Essex. So a couple of these we've talked about already. I think we've got the Data Ethics Canvas and the Essex Data Ethics Committee, but it might be something that you would want to consider for a project if you're Essex-based public sector. We've also mentioned, I think, the Consequences Scanning Toolkit, another ODI product. This one's a little bit more of a light touch assessment, so it might be a good go-to if you've got a slightly smaller project or a quicker turnaround time. Really worth a look. There's the Central Digital and Data Office Data Ethics Framework, which is another alternative. This is a kind of self-assessment process, a similar kind of thing. It's specifically designed for the public sector. So again, really good way to kind of structure those ethics conversations and build up kind of the transparency, the accountability. Really encourages that kind of documented process so that you can kind of share back what you're doing, what you're thinking around different projects. We've also mentioned the data ethics maturity assessment as something that we've kicked off with Essex. A really good way to get a sense of where your organisation is at the moment, and to kind of set up that benchmark so that you can continue to monitor progress in the ethics space. So this is something we've done fairly recently, and it's also a really good starting point if you're just kind of starting to think about data ethics with your organisation. It's a general organizational view rather than kind of project specific, so that's quite helpful. If your team is building algorithms or you're building algorithms, then the algorithmic transparency standard, a little bit of a mouthful, is a kind of government resource to help build that transparency and sort of embed that ethical practice. So it's part of the national data strategy, the national AI strategy. So it's kind of the direction that nationally things are going, that it's likely to be an expectation in the future. So a really good, important process to kind of get involved with in terms of documenting what decisions we're making, what kind of processes we're using. We mentioned the kind of Lottie case study library with that kind of TFL example, but also lots of really good examples in there, lots of other kind of case studies, definitely worth a look. And finally, kind of for Essex, internal Essex County Council colleagues, we've got kind of our internal insight portal, which you might have heard us talking about before. And we're also kind of got that internal process. Get in touch with us in the data team, in the research team, to hear more about kind of how you can sort of include data ethics conversations within your team, or to have kind of a further conversation. And again, the community, the practice are available. It's really important to be talking to each other about this. It's really, really helpful to kind of have people be part of that conversation. So keep talking to us. We'd love to hear what you are doing. And finally, the module I think Emily also mentioned. So these are some, there are plenty of other kind of approaches out there, but hopefully some of these will be helpful. There'll be something to take away. think we've got a few minutes left at the end for a couple of questions. If we have any questions in the chat, we'll have a little quick look. But thank you all for joining us. I hope that's been helpful as an intro to data ethics.